What happens when the new world collides headfirst with the ancient one? When common sense, rooted only in what the eye can see, dares to mock a deep wisdom inherited from the earth itself. Can a man truly outrun the depths of his ancestors, or is he simply setting a trap he must one day walk into? In the heart of a small, dusty village, far from the city's blinding lights, a silent bargain was struck between progress and tradition. The cost of that choice was not measured in coin, but in the quiet terror of what can be lost. This isn't just a story about a young man's arrogance. It's a tale about the profound distance between simply listening and truly heeding the voice of the elders. Before his name became the whisper of a village legend, there was Michael. A son. A grandson. A child of the village. Welcome to Stories by the King, where every story carries a heartbeat, and every truth demands to be heard. Now, before we begin, where in the world are you watching from? Is it morning in Lagos, evening in Nairobi, or midnight in London? Drop your location in the comments below, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Now, lean in. Because this isn't just about what happened, it's about what it means. The sun was a brazen, indifferent eye over the small village of Umwezela, and Michael, 25 years old and already a success in the capital city, despised its relentless heat. He stood on the edge of his grandmother's compound, a gleaming, imported watch on his wrist, and felt only a profound, dismissive pity for the quiet, dusty world he had left behind. He had returned to bury his father, but his true mission was to sell the ancestral land. Grandma Beatrice, he declared, hands thrust into the pockets of his tailored trousers, the spirits you talk about cannot pay for cement. This land is worth a fortune. It's time we modernized. Beatrice, a woman whose skin was map of every year the sun had crossed the sky, simply shook her head, her gaze fixed on the dense line of Iroko trees that marked the back of the property. My son, a land is not only dirt. It is memory. It is the agreement between the living and those who watch from the other side. Do not wake what sleeps beneath the soil, Michael. You are laughing at a warning that was paid for with tears. Michael had laughed, a short, sharp burst of contempt. He remembered her words echoing in the sterile, air-conditioned office of the land agent 2 days later. The land is sacred, Michael. The great Iroko tree at the boundary is a witness. Do not cut it down. He'd signed the papers anyway. He needed the money to finance his new electronics business. The spirits, he reasoned, could open a factory of their own if they were so powerful. Beatrice's wisdom, to him, was nothing but the charming, predictable fear of an old woman who knew no better. Yet, every evening, as the shadows lengthened and the village sounds died down, an unease, cold and persistent, would crawl into his chest. It was the feeling a man gets when he is standing too close to the edge of a great cliff, and he tries to ignore the wind that whispers of the fall. He kept telling himself it was the stress of his father's burial, nothing more. But the village seemed to change its mood with the sun's descent. The usual symphony of crickets and distant voices gave way to a silence that felt heavy, almost judgmental. One night, while scrolling through his phone, Michael saw Beatrice outside, performing a ritual he had always dismissed as foolish. She poured a libation of palm wine on the dry earth beneath the ancestral shrine and spoke in a low, pleading tone to the air. I beg you, fathers. It is the ignorance of the young, not the malice. Forgive the boy. Do not let the price of his arrogance be his life. Michael watched, not with fear, but with annoyance. He felt the weight of his progress, his education, his city life success, and he saw her as a beautiful, doomed relic of a time that should have passed. He felt utterly disconnected from her fears, convinced he was above them. The agent, a portly man named Mr. Chokuma, arrived the next morning, ready to hand over the first installment and finalize the deal. He glanced nervously at the Iroko tree, towering over the property like a sentinel. The new buyer is eager to begin construction, Mr. Michael. But he insists on one thing: the boundary must be cleared. The tree must come down. It blocks his vision for the access road. Michael felt a momentary prickle of caution. This tree had been a fixture of his childhood, a giant whose roots seemed to hold the very earth together. Yet, the thought of the money, the new business, the envy of his peers, was a stronger current than his inherited fear. He walked to the tree, his hand resting on the rough bark, and felt nothing, no power, no presence, only wood. "Fine," he declared, pulling his hand away, the decision ringing with the finality of a bell. "Tell him to cut it down. Today." Beatrice watched from the doorway, her face unreadable, her eyes like smoldering coals. She did not argue or beg. She only offered a single, desolate statement, her voice barely a whisper that nonetheless filled the compound: "The agreement is broken. And the spirits of the ancestors, they do not send a messenger. They come themselves." As Mr. Chokuma drove off, a triumphant grin on his face, Michael thought the worst was over. He had defied the ancient laws and won. He would be rich. But as he settled down that evening, the axe strokes of the laborers already faintly audible in the distance, a different kind of quiet fell over Unwesela. It was a silence that held its breath, and Michael, despite himself, could not shake the sudden, bone-deep certainty that he was not alone in his own house. The first thing Michael noticed was the sound. Not the noise of an animal or a person, but the absence of sound, the sudden, complete cessation of all the ambient nighttime music of the village. The crickets, the distant generator hum, the barking of the lonely dog, all silenced. It was the kind of silence that presses in on your ears, making you acutely aware of your own blood rushing. He was alone in the main sitting room, sipping a cold drink and trying to dismiss the knot of anxiety in his stomach. The tree, he knew, was gone. The laborers had walked until dusk, the thud of the mighty Iroko hitting the ground sounding, to his ears, like a distant, satisfying thunderclap. He had won. He should have felt relief, but instead, a new kind of chill settled over him, one that had nothing to do with the outside temperature. He heard a door close in the kitchen. He went to investigate, his heart thumping a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The kitchen was empty, the windows tightly shut, but the heavy iron pot his grandmother used for cooking soup had been moved from the center of the wood fire tripod to the cold floor. It was a mundane sight, yet utterly chilling, for he knew Beatrice would never leave her cooking tools so carelessly. He turned to leave, and a sudden movement in the periphery of his vision froze him. A shadow, darker than the night outside, slipped around the corner of the doorway. It was not the shadow of a human, for it had no discernible shape, merely a dense, moving blot of nothingness that seemed to suck the light out of the room. Michael felt a raw, primal terror grip his throat. He wanted to shout for Beatrice, but the name cut like a bone, lodged in fear. He stumbled back into the sitting room and crashed onto the sofa, trying to rationalize it away, the wind, his nerves, a trick of the kerosene lamp's light. But the silence returned, and this time, it was accompanied by a sound so low it vibrated in his chest rather than his ears, a deep, ancient humming, like 1,000 bees caught in the hollow of a great log. Then the scent came. The rich, earthy smell of wet soil and old palm oil, the traditional scent of a libation, strong enough to suggest a presence, but with no visible source. Michael looked around the room, and on the small, wooden stool by the entrance, a thin layer of red sand, the kind used in ancestral rites, had appeared, seemingly from nowhere. The most terrifying thing was not what he saw, but what he felt. The temperature in the room plummeted, and he felt the profound, overwhelming sense of being judged. It was not the judgment of a man, but of an old, patient force that had watched the cycles of the earth turn for centuries. The feeling intensified until he was gasping, the air seeming too thick to breathe. He finally managed a strangled whisper, "Grandma." Beatrice, and immediately regretted it, for as soon as he spoke, the humming stopped, and a voice, not heard with his ears, but with the empty space behind them, spoke. It was a voice composed of rustling leaves and cracking earth, dry and utterly cold. "You laugh at the agreements, son of the soil. You sell the memory for metal. Now you will learn what it means to be indebted. Michael sprang up, desperate for the safety of Beatrice's room, located at the back of the compound. He ran, tripping over his own feet, driven by a fear that had finally stripped away all his modern arrogance. He burst into her room, finding her sitting bolt upright in her bed, her eyes wide open, but staring past him. "Grandma," he cried, grabbing her arm. "Did you hear that?" I saw something." She turned her head slowly toward him, and in the dim light of a single lamp, Michael saw that she was not comforted by his presence. Her face was a mask of sorrow and resignation. "They are here, Michael. They have come to claim their payment, as I warned you. The spirits of the Iroko are not gentle travelers. You invited them in when you commanded the axe to fall." He looked at her then, truly saw her, not as a superstitious old woman, but as a terrified messenger of a truth he had brutally ignored. And as the chilling hum began again, louder this time, shaking the foundations of the small house, Michael knew, with a certainty that erased all his years of city-acquired cynicism, that the night was just beginning. The shadows in Beatrice's room began to writhe. They stretched and coalesced, not in the corners, but in the open space, swelling into forms that were almost human, but utterly devoid of warmth or light. Michael stood paralyzed, pressed against the wall, watching his grandmother slowly rise from her bed. Her hands were clasped, and she began to chant in a language he had never heard, one that tasted of stone and rain. It was a lament, a pleading, a desperate attempt to bridge the chasm his arrogance had torn between the living and the watching. One of the figures, taller and denser than the rest, glided toward him. It had no face, yet Michael felt its stare, a hollow, penetrating gaze that seemed to examine the very root of his soul, seeking the flaw, the depth. The spirit reached out, and Michael felt a crushing pressure on his chest, as if all the earth was being piled upon him. The voice of rustling leaves and cracking earth spoke again, raw and echoing, "The memory of the land is the life of the children. You sold the memory. You have cancelled the contract. The price is your life force. Where there was a tree, there will be a tomb." Michael saw his life flash before him, not the glittering success he chased, but the quiet moments he'd mocked, his father patiently teaching him to climb the Iroko, his grandmother leaving food by the roots, the communal stories told beneath its canopy. It was a memory of connection, of belonging, a wealth he had dismissed as worthless. He finally understood, he hadn't just sold land, he had sold his birthright, his spiritual shield, and the protection of his ancestors. Beatrice's chant reached a frantic crescendo. She stepped forward, deliberately placing herself between Michael and the spectral figure. "Take me," she cried, her voice cracking but resolute. "The boy is ignorant, but he is the last of my line. His life is long, mine is near its end. Take my years. Let the debt fall to me. Forgive his rashness." The spirit hesitated, the air around it shimmering violently. Michael watched, tears streaming down his face, his body still locked in an agony of terror, as his grandmother offered everything he had so easily thrown away. In that moment, the true meaning of the land, of tradition, and of unconditional love was revealed to him. It wasn't about the soil, it was about the sacrifice. The spirit did not touch Beatrice. Instead, it recoiled, a low, drawn-out sound like 1,000 distant sighs filling the room. The dense shadows began to dissipate, dissolving first into wisps, then into the ordinary darkness of the night. The humming ceased. The cold receded. The silence was broken, not by the return of the natural village sounds, but by the distant, weary crow of a rooster, a sound that signifies the turning of the night. Michael collapsed onto the floor, weak and shaking, his terror replaced by a profound, agonizing shame. He looked up at Beatrice. She stood before him, her shoulders slumped, her breathing shallow, but her eyes held a peaceful, terrible clarity. "The debt is settled, my son," she whispered, sinking back onto her bed. "But the cost is always paid. Michael did not become a wealthy city dweller. He cancelled the sale the very next morning, begging Mr. Chokuma to return the money, even though it meant crippling debt. He spent the next 5 years of his life replanting and tending to the earth he had tried to betray, not as a punishment, but as a profound act of penance and respect. He never once laughed at a tradition again. He stayed in Umwesola, tending to his grandmother until the gentle day she passed away, her hand resting on the smooth, new bark of the sapling he had planted where the great Iroko once stood. He chose to become the caretaker of the memory, the gatekeeper of the agreement. Michael never became the electronics mogul he dreamed of. But he learned to speak the language of the soil, of the seasons, and of the quiet, watchful presence of the ancestors. The true success was not in the millions he could have made, but in the years he gained, but not with his own money, but with his grandmother's profound love and sacrifice. Not because of the life he chose after, but because he finally chose to listen with his soul, rather than with his ears. And a man who chooses connection over comfort, humility over hustle, and memory over materialism, will never lead his family wrong. If this story moved you, hit like, share it, and tell me in the comments, what is one warning you have heard from an elder that you still struggle to believe? Subscribe to Stories by the King, where every story carries a heartbeat, and every choice carries a lesson. This is Stories by the King, where love wins, and purpose finds its home.